So in honor of David Lynch passing away a couple of days ago, I thought I'd make this video about my opinion on the man and his works. I've only watched a handful of his works. Really, the only opus that I'm familiar with to David Lynch's name is Twin Peaks, which I plan to make this video about. More recently, I did watch the film Eraserhead with my brother, and that was just a weird film, man. And I would have thought, given that Eraserhead was his directorial debut, I'd have thought that it would have been a bit more, what's the word? Conventional. Like, because he was finding his feet as a movie director, he would have started out small with the weirdness, the abstract stuff, and then worked his way up from there. But no, it's funny to think how in the final series of Twin Peaks, which is really weird and, you know, I'm not too much of a fan of, which was directed in 2017, and his first ever movie, Eraserhead, which came out in 1977, it seems like there are very few differences between them. The man seems to have retained his signature style of filmmaking throughout, which I find remarkably consistent and eerie. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I wanted to make this a brief summary of my thoughts on Twin Peaks, because I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought Twin Peaks was a really enjoyable experience. I'm glad that I discovered it. It's obviously acquired a cult following throughout the years. It was huge back in its time. I think my parents remember watching it, and they were hooked onto it. And David Lynch has directed many films over the years. I haven't seen Mulholland Drive. I haven't seen Inland Empire or The Elephant Man or any of his other works, which are said to be fantastic. But as far as I'm concerned, Twin Peaks, from my point of view, is his masterpiece. And I will keep up this opinion. I will maintain this opinion until I've seen one of David Lynch's works, which, in my view, hits me harder, affects me better than Twin Peaks. So, Twin Peaks, what's it about? It was released in 1990, starring Kyle MacLachlan and I can't even remember. Kyle MacLachlan is the main character, right? For all intents and purposes, it's an early 90s surreal crime drama set in the mysterious border town between the United States and Canada called Twin Peaks in North Washington. In a vast, desolate wilderness surrounded by Douglas fir, pine trees and open plains, shrouded in mystery and local Native American mythology. The town of Twin Peaks, with an estimated population of something like 50,000. So a very small community where everyone knows each other. There's a beautiful, popular young woman by the name of Laura Palmer, who everyone knows at the high school. I think she's a cheerleader. Basically, she's really beautiful, and everyone knows her and loves her, and she's brutally raped and murdered, and her body is discovered wrapped up in a sheet of plastic one morning, and everyone in the whole community is absolutely devastated. So the plot of Twin Peaks revolves around the local sheriff, Harry Truman, and the suave, dashing young FBI agent Dale Cooper, who's played by Kyle MacLachlan, and their attempts to uncover the mystery behind her death. That's how it is for the first part of the series in any case. Now, the first thing about the series that I found absolutely fascinating is it's essentially a time capsule into early 90s American culture, rural American culture. This was a time before the internet. It was before social media, before OnlyFans, before any of the diseases, the pestilences of modernity had plagued our civilization. And there were small isolated communities where people knew each other, everybody got along, and there was trust in the media, the police, and the institutions. And it's fascinating looking into this now from the perspective of somebody in the 2020s, where I feel like it just seems like our society has completely gone adrift. but that is the world that used to exist. It's the world that we used to inhabit, and it's fascinating to look back on now, even though I'm sure for its time it probably would have been considered rather mundane and normal. There's lots of beautiful, good-looking actresses in that movie, like Madchen Amick. You know, lots of people talk about Madchen Amick and how stunning she is. You know, I think she's all right personally, but I can see why lots of people think that she's beautiful. But personally, in my honest opinion, the star actress of the whole show, somebody who is absolute 10 out of 10 for me, is Sherilyn Fenn. She plays Audrey Horne in the series, and my goodness, it feels weird for me to admit this as a 30-year-old man, but I think I am in love with Sherilyn Fenn, the actress from 40 years ago, back when she was in her prime. She has gorgeous jet black hair, deep brown eyes. You know, she was designed to be a seductress, a femme fatale, you know, a woman with her wicked feminine wild. She's not necessarily a bad person, but she's very good looking, and she's acutely aware of it throughout the entirety of the series. And I'm saying that David Lynch made a spectacular choice choosing her for this role. But she's not the only one. There's lots of beautiful, good-looking women, and the men were also quite, well, especially by the standards of nowadays, the men were rugged, they were tough, handsome, and they knew what was expected of them back in society. You know, there's the football jock, Bobby Briggs, who's a tough guy who wears a leather jacket, smoking cigarettes. Well, lots of people do. Then there's his mate, Mike, or Snake, I think he's called. Then there's James Hurley, who also I think has a perfecto leather jacket and drives a motorcycle. You know, it feels like nowadays we've become so we've become so clueless as to what it means to be masculine and feminine, because there's been all this institutional propaganda telling us that neither of the two words mean anything. But back then they clearly meant something. You know, there were these implicit gender roles in society, and everybody knew and understood them. It was such a simpler time, and that's probably the first, maybe possibly even the main thing that I find so enchanting about it. It was a totally different time where, you know, with a meaningful culture that meant something. It was the kind of community that you want to be a part of. Now, a word on speaking of community. One of the things that strikes you that in the very first episode, in the first few episodes, is you feel just how tightly knit this community is, because everyone in the community in some way is affected by Laura Palmer's death, because she was very popular. Everyone knew her. Everyone is devastated. Everyone is broken into tears. All her friends who knew and loved her, her former boyfriend, Bobby Briggs, who's unfortunately, you know, in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he's being accused of having murdered her. And you find out that there's been a bit of a love triangle situation between her and James Hurley, and the two are basically at each other's throats early on. But it really goes to show what modernity has taken from us, because we all deserve to live in places like this, where what is essentially a community? Well, it's like a neighborhood of close families. It's a family of families, basically. Not necessarily people who are blood related, but everyone knows each other by name. Everyone lives and associates each other. This was a world before globalization took over. You know, there's actually a sawmill, a wooden factory that hasn't been outsourced to China or India or something like that. What else is there? There's a gas station that's run by a local family and hasn't been taken over by Indians or Pakistanis. There's no black people. Well, I think there's one black nurse who works there or something, you know, for the FBI, you know, running tests on the victim when she's killed. But other than that, it's mostly a purely homogenous society that has deep roots in the land. The mythical utopia that we've been continuously told over the past decades never existed and never was. Well, Twin Peaks is living proof of that. It gives you, even, I say this, right, even as somebody who was never alive at the time of Twin Peaks being filmed and never got to experience this late 80s, early 90s Americana, I feel at home, weirdly enough, in it. I feel like I know each of the characters personally and intimately. I understand each and every one of them and their flaws. I have a deep connection and attachment to all of them. And honestly, during the scene, I think in the second episode, during Laura Palmer's funeral, where everyone is absolutely wrecked with grief and misery and mourning, I felt grief as well, even though I never personally knew Laura Palmer. And David Lynch is he is a very effective communicator of these strong emotions that are felt by all the characters in this small little community of Twin Peaks. You can viscerally feel in your guts just how tight the bonds were with each and every person, even though by this point early on you're not familiar with all the characters and what their backstories are. And David Lynch wouldn't be able to pull this off. He wouldn't be able to transmit these strong feelings without the help of the absolutely terrific, the evocative and emotionally tense, compact film score by Angelo Badalamenti. Angelo Badalamenti, by the way, he actually passed away a couple of years ago, back in late 2022, before David Lynch did. And honestly, I think Angelo Badalamenti deserves just as much credit for the success of Twin Peaks as does David Lynch and Mark Frost. Because without his work, the series just wouldn't be as effective as it is. The film score, it really takes you back in time. There's a mixture of vintage, late 80s synth pads replete with pianos, with a modulated chorus effect. It's just so beautiful. And I don't know if I've ever given my opinion on this before, but modern music is it's rubbish. I would compare it to junk food, but at least junk food tastes good. Listening to modern music is like, it's not like eating junk food. It's like eating the packaging that it comes in. It's like eating raw plastic. It's just noise. I can't stand it. So we have a mesmerizing film score by Angelo Badalamenti, surreal and really well-crafted dialogue and cinematography by David Lynch and Mark Frost. The family, the community, the whole neighborhood, the whole town of Twin Peaks is torn apart by Laura Palmer's death. It's fascinating to see how the world was different back in those days. You could see, by the way, there are some elderly characters who still have those perm haircuts that we associate with the 80s. But as this was set in the 90s, this is the time when perm haircuts were basically on their way out and people were beginning to rediscover, just not, dressing yourself in an outrageous, in-your-face manner as it was in the late 80s. So there were more conventional haircuts at the time, which you don't really see nowadays. Nowadays, every single person has some disgusting tattoo or nose ring. You can't even tell half the time if women are biologically female or if they're transsexual. Yeah, none of that rubbish existed in the early 90s. It's a mythical time. I touched upon this earlier, how there was none of this confusion over who was who and what was what. It's this gender nonsense rubbish that we get taught in school. People knew who they were, they knew who they weren't, what they were and what they weren't. And that's one of the reasons why I think Sherilyn Fenn was so gorgeous, because she is the ideal woman. I promise you survey 100 men, ask them what they really want in a partner, they would point to somebody like Mädchen Amick or Sherilyn Fenn. Okay, I better stop simping over this actress from 40 years ago, because I know it sounds weird, but I promise you, you don't know true beauty until you've seen this woman in Twin Peaks. So anyway, all right, I've talked about what I love about the series. So as the series progresses, initially in the early stages of the drama, we're led to think that it's like any other crime drama. A young woman is murdered, and we got to find out who's done it. Basically, you know, a whodunit. Except the more the series progresses, the further we venture into Twin Peaks, the more we get to know the psychology of all the villagers, of all the people who live there, and Laura Palmer's past. We begin to learn a couple of things. First of all, we learn that Laura Palmer's not the perfect little angel that we think she is. She was involved in some very questionable pastimes. I'm not going to elaborate, but I'm trying to convey essentially. I'm trying to give you a synopsis of what happened without spoiling anything. She was associated with some rather questionable characters, as was her ex-boyfriend Bobby Briggs. There's all kinds of surreal subplots which go on in the background, which some of which range from bizarre and comical to bizarre and well, exactly that, just bizarre and nonsensical. There's an entire subplot where there's a criminal smuggling gang. There's a syndicate of Canadian smugglers who are transporting cocaine from across the border, and the lead character, Agent Dale Cooper, ends up in a shootout with them. It's like in an action film, and he's that's a thing that happens. There's also a subplot where this middle-aged woman called Nadine, she tries taking her own life because she's emotionally distressed, and she's in this turbulent marriage with a man who she doesn't really love, and she loses her memory and wakes up again, and she's convinced that she's a teenage girl, even though she's in her 40s or 50s, and she wears an eye patch. And she becomes enrolled in the local high school with all the other teenagers there, and she develops a crush on this teenage boy, Snake, and the two end up in a relationship together. Yeah, that's the kind of thing you learn to expect and tolerate with David Lynch and his stuff. Yeah, that's a thing that happens as well. What else is there? There's a recurring running skit, a gag where a scene takes place at the Roadhouse, which is essentially the local bar and diner where all the hip young kids hang out. Ones who are old enough to drink, I presume. Oh yeah, there's also underage drinking and drink driving, but you can tell it was an innocent time. So sort of like, obviously it's a minor infraction of the law, but nobody really cared that much about it. So there wasn't any of this, like, you get thrown in prison for any of that. And it's like, you know, boys were boys back then, and people weren't afraid to have a good time, you know, within the framework of what was, everyone knew right from wrong. There was a bit of law breaking, but it wasn't serious, you know, that kind of stuff. So anyway, as I was saying earlier, at the Roadhouse Diner, there's a recurring theme that we see. There's a recurring motif where we see a dream pop band perform a song that was in some way written by David Lynch, and we're treated to this song playing in the background while there's some heavy dialogue going on in the foreground. A good example, of course, is the main theme of the show, Falling by Julie Cruz, which was composed specifically for the series. As the series progresses, we hear more songs by Julie Cruz and some other more obscure indie bands. In the third season, interestingly, this American rock band called the Nine Inch Nails. Is it the Nine Inch Nails? Yeah, with Trent Reznor. They perform a couple of times. And I've never listened to the music of Nine Inch Nails, but I know that they're a big deal, and I wasn't expecting to hear from them. As we venture further and further and deeper into the series, we learn that Laura Palmer's death is so much more significant than we begin to realize. It's not as straightforward. It's not an isolated event in a flux of other events. We learn that a year before Laura Palmer's death, there was another young woman who went missing and was killed. Her name was Teresa Banks. And we learn that this is why Special Agent Dale Cooper was summoned to Twin Peaks in the first place, because there's a serial killer, basically, who lives and works in Twin Peaks. And there's all kinds of mysterious elements of mystery, of what's the word? Paranormal activity. Well, there's themes of paranormal. There's the supernatural, intertwined with Native American mythology, and we learn that there's a local legend of this long, greasy-haired, ugly man by the name of Bob, who wears a blue denim jacket. This mystical figure, we don't know who or what he is. Nobody's ever seen him, but he's supposed to be this mythical evil creature who takes over people's souls and makes them do terrible things. And also we learn that there's, in keeping with the local Native American folklore, there's a dark netherworld region called the Black Lodge. And this is where it gets really interesting. The Black Lodge is essentially, it's a dance floor with a checkered black and white floor and red stage curtains surrounding it. There's a dwarf sitting on a stool there. There's also a giant, although I don't think he appears in the Black Lodge. And there are scenes that we see where characters appear in the Black Lodge. Like, for instance, Dale Cooper ends up in the Black Lodge eventually, and so does the ghost of Laura Palmer. And each time a character speaks in the Black Lodge, they speak in what I can only describe as reverse phonetics. What is reverse phonetics? It's a phrase I made up for if you try speaking and then you take the audio of your spoken dialogue and then you play it in reverse, and then you try to imitate the sounds, the phonetics of the reverse audio, and then that audio itself becomes reversed, you end up with reverse phonetics. And it perfectly encapsulates the surreal ambience, the surreal atmosphere of the Black Lodge. If you want to summarize Lynchian in a nutshell, if you want to perfectly conceptualize how David Lynch got his reputation, how he cemented his reputation as a surrealist film director, well, this is a perfect example of how he does it. And it's like something you would encounter in a dream. When people speak in the Black Lodge, and you hear them speak in reverse phonetics, you can search for this on YouTube to get a good idea of what I'm talking about. But it sounds like this. Hello, Agent Cooper. I'll see you again in 25 years. So David Lynch is, you get a feel for what kind of film director David Lynch is. He's very effective at creating an unsettling, ambient atmosphere, the likes of which you normally find in a dream, where you have so many questions you don't even know where to start. But what I especially find effective about Twin Peaks is David Lynch wasn't the sole writer and director of the series. Mark Frost also worked on it, and I have a sort of theory, right, that if David Lynch if he had retained total creative control over the entire series, it would have been so bizarre and so random and nonsensical, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it that much. But Mark Frost, on the other hand, I think I feel like he had a role in tempering David Lynch's creative vision so as to make it conventional enough, compounded with David Lynch's penchant for the absurd and the mysterious to make it a really captivating, gripping, and bizarre but memorable series. I think I've told you basically how I feel about the series and what happens, and given you a good enough idea without spoiling anything, at least anything major. But if you'd want to know more, I highly recommend that you watch both series of Twin Peaks, although I wouldn't really recommend you watch the third series because it just seems like David Lynch completely lost he completely ran out of ideas. There's all kinds of random stuff that happens in this third series, and there's no real sense of closure or resolution. None of it makes sense. Honestly, if I were you, I'd just stick to seasons 1 and 2, because that's... Honestly, it should have ended at season 2 in all honesty. But yeah, it's an absolutely fascinating series. You can find and purchase all episodes of both series on Apple TV. I can't remember how much for, but yeah, Netflix doesn't show them because Netflix is rubbish. I don't think it's on Disney Plus either. But if you're bored, if you're feeling jaded, you want to experience something new, but you're not sure what, you feel like you've seen and done everything there is to see in life, and there's nothing new out there, and I recommend you take the time to introduce yourself to the works of David Lynch and start with Twin Peaks. I promise you, it's a really rewarding and intense experience, and you'll thank me for it. Anyway, on to my collection run. You guys take care and enjoy yourselves. Also, rest in peace, David Lynch. You did us some good work.